Mr. Dold, again, like so many of our witnesses, I think hearing the full story or a capsule of the story lets us see a different world than you can imagine. And in his particular case, the type of grooming and the type of victimization that he endured as a child. Mr. Dold.
Come forward, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you so much, Delegate Watts, for bringing this bill forward as well. We've worked together many years on child protection issues as well as criminal justice reform for kids, and so this has been something that's been near and dear to your heart, so I thank you very much for that. I thought that I might just open my testimony up real quick. I've worked across the country in a previous life to help draft anti-human trafficking laws for states as far west as Hawaii, as well as right here in Virginia, working with Delegate Watts, former Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, an incredible bipartisan coalition that we put together several years ago. And I thought that as we talk about human trafficking, it was really important for the committee to understand, particularly as it relates to children, how most child victims of trafficking end up in the situations that they do, whether we're talking about sex trafficking victims or labor trafficking victims. And really what it boils down to is this notion of exploitation and how kids end up vulnerable in the first place. And so when we're looking at this bill, it's important to contextualize how most traffickers operate when it comes to children. First, they're looking for vulnerable children. Oftentimes, they're kids who are coming from low-income communities, kids who are going through trauma in their life or have already experienced trauma. Oftentimes, they're children of color who have experienced trauma in their lives. And what these traffickers do, just like any other pedophile, is they engage in the grooming process. And what that often entails is developing a relationship with the child where they develop trust and they get into the child's DNA, essentially, right? And as that trust is developed, then the relationship becomes sexualized. And this is a key component because at that point in time, what happens is the formation of what's called a traumatic bond. And when traumatic bonds form, it's a super intense feeling of love and devotion, almost this misplaced sense of loyalty. It's talked about oftentimes in the context of domestic violence relationships. People often refer to it with Stockholm Syndrome. But the key to understanding this connection is that this overwhelming sense of love and devotion where the child will do anything that the adult asks of them. Right? So when we're talking about child sex trafficking, oftentimes, it's not that, a child is necessarily being beaten and forced into these situations. It's that a pedophile has gotten into their DNA, a child has formed a traumatic bond, and now the child is willing to do anything for that person. This also applies in the context of labor trafficking as well. So I wanted to share a little bit about my personal story and how this happened to me. I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, before I became an attorney and moved out to the East Coast. And I met my abuser in the Boy Scouts of America. They were a volunteer parent, actually. So it was through my church, Christian Life Community. I was a Boy Scout. I was a star on my way to becoming a Star Scout. And I was a kid, just like I described. I had experienced a lot of early childhood trauma. I had been sexually abused earlier in life. And I was dealing with a lot of internal strife as I was entering my teenage years. So I was 13 when I met my abuser. I had just finished my 7th grade year in middle school. And just like any other pedophile, what happened was, I thought that this person cared about me and loved me and was willing to do anything for me. I began to confide in this person the abuse that I had previously experienced, everything that was going wrong in my life. And through that process, that trust developed. And then one night, this person started to sexually abuse me. First, it started off small, so it's an incremental process, right? So it began with touching. And this person began to touch my private areas, right? But I thought that this was love. I thought that this person cared for me, and this is what I wanted as a 13-year-old boy. And that continued to escalate over the next several months. So as I went into 8th grade and I turned 14, it eventually escalated into statutory sexual assault. As a side note, in one of the bills that was heard earlier, when I finally was able to build up the courage to report what happened to me when I was 28 years old, the statute of limitations in Nevada had similarly run. right? And that was 10 years after the fact because there's a 3-year statute of limitations there. So I just want to also point out that the importance of the previous bill that we heard is significant for kids because it's so often so traumatic and so difficult to come forward after these experiences have finally bubbled up and people feel comfortable sharing those experiences. But for me, as this all unfolded when I was in the 8th grade, I decided that, I was going to run away from my house and I was going to go live with this other family. And that's what I did, and in part at the encouragement of my abuser. So I lived in this other house with another parent, other children, and because I had that traumatic bond, and I was willing to do anything that parent asked of me, I was cooking, I was cleaning, I was, for all intents and purposes, a domestic servant for a little under 2 years of my life. During this whole time, I was denigrated. The abuse involved domestic violence, it involved physical abuse, it involved the sexual abuse, the statutory rape, it involved emotional abuse, to the point where I was denigrated, I was called the N-word repeatedly, and the whole process behind that, right, is to tear down the child, right? So what abusers do, they build you up, they tear you down. They build you up, they tear you down. And the reason for that is to develop a mechanism of control. So what Delegate Watts' bill is about criminalizing the grooming process by which children who are in situations like me, where there's an adult in a position of authority or power or custodian who engages in sexual abuse of a child, who engages in carnal knowledge of a child, statutory rape, and then obtains labor or services. So the idea is that the grooming process is criminalized, and that the child that has been exploited, the labor services part, like me with the babysitting, the cooking, the cleaning, becomes a part of this child labor trafficking situation. I was thankful because I was able to tell my story to my home state in Nevada back in 2013, and they passed very similar legislation there with the support of the law enforcement community and the Attorney General's office. The idea behind this bill is to make it easier for prosecutors to be able to prosecute cases like mine, where there's this exploitative labor dynamic in addition to the sexual abuse that occurs. Because for a long time I struggled. One part of my story that I didn't go into was there was one point, I was about 14 or 15, at my lowest point, when I didn't see any way out, really. I'd just been beaten up by this person, and I hid in my abuser's closet, and I knew that they had a 22 silver handgun in the closet, and I pulled it down, and I sat in this closet, and it was dark, and I just held the gun to my head, and I knew that I felt like I didn't have the courage to pull the trigger, but I wanted to feel what it was like to just imagine not being alive, because the traumatic bond was that intense, it was that powerful, that I felt that there was no escape from what that I was experiencing. So it's not just that this was sexual abuse and statutory rape. It was increased because the traumatic bond, the sense of love that I developed with my abusers, was used against me to get me to do their bidding, cleaning, cooking, taking care of kids. And that exploitation went on for years. And I lost a part of my childhood. It took me years to get that back. And there's a part of me that died that day that I'll never get back from that abuse that I experienced. So with that, I know I've been talking for a long time and it's late, but I just wanted to share my stories and my experiences and urge the committee to pass this legislation. I realize that there might need to be some tinkering with the language, but it's really important to make it easier on prosecutors being able to prosecute these types of cases, because it's cases like mine, but it's also child sex trafficking victims. I'll say this, with pimps and traffickers, as they operate, it's not just that they're forcing kids into prostitution. The exploitation doesn't just end there. When the girls come home, or the boys come home for that matter, and they're at home, these same people are also forcing them to take care of kids, do chores and housework, all those sorts of things as well. So it's really important for law enforcement and prosecutors to understand sort of how this is not a myopic issue, and that oftentimes kids who experience sex trafficking are also experiencing labor trafficking, and vice versa. And with that, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'll close. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for your advocacy and for your work and for being able to share your experience, and I appreciate that.